You know, there are these moments in history that feel just like a stone dropped into a perfectly still pond. The splash is sudden, it's violent, and it's impossible to miss. But it's the ripples, the silent, unstoppable ripples that travel so much further, and in the end, they change the shape of everything. This is the story of one of those moments, and the incredible waves of change it sent washing over all of us.
And look, that's not being dramatic, it's the simple truth. A line was crossed, and not just a line on a map, but a line through time itself. What we're all witnessing isn't just a conflict, it's the end of one entire era of history, and the turbulent, uncertain birth of whatever comes next. So let's explore how that world was broken and what seems to be rising from its ashes.
So that first impact, the biggest shock, it wasn't a bomb, it wasn't a physical explosion, it was the shattering of an idea, the very idea of the world we all thought we were living in. Think about it. For more than 30 years, we lived with this sense of order, an order built on pillars that we all kind of took for granted, things we saw as permanent, international law, the sovereignty of nations, the basic belief that borders couldn't just be erased by force. And then, in 2022, those pillars just crumbled. It left every single nation scrambling to answer a new and frankly terrifying question. So, what are the rules now?
And that first shockwave? Man, it sent a ripple through the West almost instantly. Down the corridors of power, deep inside defense ministries, it was like a sleeping giant got a massive jolt of electricity.
The change was just, wow, it was fast. You had an alliance, NATO, that people were literally dismissing as brain dead, an organization that seemed adrift without a real mission. And then, boom, it was reignited. It found a new, urgent purpose, and it became more unified than it had been in decades. I mean, you had countries like Finland and Sweden, nations that had been neutral for generations, suddenly scrambling to join up for protection?
Now this reawakening wasn't just talk. It came with a huge, huge price tag. Just look at these numbers for countries like Germany and Poland. We're talking about decades of foreign and military policy being completely overturned, almost overnight. What you're really seeing here is an entire continent taking a hard look in the mirror and fundamentally reassessing its own survival, bracing for a future that suddenly felt a whole lot more dangerous.
But, this wasn't just happening in government buildings. Right there on the ground, on the battlefield itself, this whole conflict became a kind of laboratory, a testing ground for a totally new kind of warfare, one that's fought on two fronts, one you can see and one you really can't.
This invisible war, its battlefield isn't made of mud and trenches. It exists in our computer networks. It exists in our own minds. It's this relentless, non-stop battle of information. It's waged with cyber attacks that can shut down a country's power grid, and with disinformation campaigns that turn your social media feed into a weapon. In this kind of war, the line between who's a soldier and who's a civilian gets really, really blurry. And the first casualty? The truth.
Okay, so that's the invisible part. But then you have the visible revolution. And this is where we saw the absolutely terrifying power of simple, low-cost drones. And I'm not just talking about those big military predators. I'm talking about drones you can buy online, modified in a workshop, becoming the eyes and the fists of a modern army. This technology completely rewrote the rulebook. It leveled the playing field in shocking ways and kicked off a whole new age of warfare.
The next great ripple that spread across the globe wasn't a military one. It was economic. It was like an invisible weapon was pulled right out of the ground, and it sent a tremor through the very foundations of the global economy.
Just look at that number. Over 200%. That was the spike in European natural gas prices. And believe me, this was no simple market fluctuation. This was a deliberate shock, a weaponized cold designed to creep into every home, every business, designed to make an entire continent feel the pressure.
And that, right there, is what we mean by weaponized energy, using a country's own natural resources as a lever of power. But here's the thing, the counter-reaction was just as powerful. Instead of forcing submission, it triggered this frantic global realignment. Europe started racing to find new energy partners. The switch to green energy got a massive shot of adrenaline. And the energy maps of the entire world were fundamentally redrawn right before our eyes.
All this turmoil, this huge clash between the traditional powers, it created an opening on the world stage. And from that opening, a vast and powerful group of nations began to step up, to assert its own voice, and to refuse to play by the old rules.
We often like to see the world in simple terms, don't we? For or against. But this chart of a key UN vote it reveals a much more complex reality. A huge portion of the world, much of what we call the Global South, they chose a third path, neutrality. They refused to be dragged into a conflict that they saw as a struggle between old empires.
And let me tell you why that matters so profoundly. That neutrality, it wasn't indecision. It was a declaration of independence. It was these nations prioritizing their own futures, their own interests. What it signals is the true end of a world dominated by just one or two superpowers and the dawn of a multipolar age, with many, many competing centers of power.
So where do all these ripples lead? Well, the story, of course, isn't over. The ink on this chapter of history is not yet dry. We are all living through the consequences, watching the architecture of a new world order being constructed all around us, piece by unpredictable piece. And we can start to see the shape of it, the emerging contours of this new order. We're seeing a new global arms race gaining speed. We're hearing that chilling, newly urgent debate over nuclear weapons. We're watching the very institutions designed to keep the peace straining under the weight of these new realities, all while that multipolar world solidifies, becoming more complex and more dangerous.
That final ripple from that stone dropped in the water, it still hasn't reached the shore. This conflict didn't create these forces out of thin air, but it acted like a massive catalyst, accelerating a future that was already rushing toward us anyway. And it leaves us with the most important and unsettling question of our time. In a world with many competing powers, with shifting alliances and no clear rules, what comes next?
At Geotectonics, our mission is to uncover these profound tectonic shifts, offering clarity in a world of complexity. If this analysis deepened your understanding, please like this video to support our work, share it with others who seek real insight, and subscribe to Geotectonics to ensure you never miss our next deep dive. We'll continue to explore the crucial geopolitical movements that define our time. Thank you for joining us.